Chapter 5 is a fairly short chapter, and it's the last one before we enter into the next unit on assessment. Remember, we're not going to cover Chapter 6, the research chapter, in this class. I think you've been exposed to research in previous classes by now, and you're going to use your research know-how to do your clinical specialty paper anyway. So I didn't think it was necessary to add that in. But you can read Chapter 6 if you want for your own need, for your own knowledge. Just keep in mind that we're not going to cover it, and we're not going to be quizzed on it. Okay? Okay, so what is Chapter 5 about? It's about ethical and professional issues in clinical psychology. And to start us off, I want you to imagine you're a clinical psychologist, but maybe also a superhero. Yeah, superhero. Your superpower is the ability to understand human behavior, heal emotional wounds, and guide people toward a better life. But with great power always comes what? I hope you said great responsibility, because that would be right. Great responsibility. Just like superheroes, clinical psychologists have an incredible responsibility. But unlike superheroes, we don't have a secret identity. We're held accountable every day, and we should be held accountable every day. We're held accountable by things like the ethical codes, by laws, by professional guidelines. So I want to explore some tricky and surprising and maybe even uncomfortable ethical dilemmas in clinical psychology just for a moment with you to get us started in this area. The first ethical dilemma I want to kind of talk about is the good mistake. Can helping be harmful? So to do this, I want you to imagine a therapist has a client struggling with severe depression. The client doesn't have insurance and can't afford sessions. Now, you probably recognize this dilemma from when I described my experience with an insurance company only paying for 10 sessions when my client needed more. Remember that one? Well, the therapist, moved by compassion, offers free therapy outside of their practice. The question is, though, is this ethical? Now, it seems like a kind and noble act, doesn't it? I mean, if you think about it for just a moment, what would be wrong with that? Well, let me tell you, it sort of blurs professional boundaries. For example, what if something goes wrong? Who's responsible? And how does this affect the therapist's objectivity? And what I particularly want you to remember is that ethics are not just about avoiding harm to the client. They also protect the therapist and ensure treatment is effective and professional. So I guess my point here is that sometimes what feels right isn't always ethically right. Okay? Okay. So let's see. The second ethical dilemma I wanted to talk about was the no secrets rule. So this is in reference to the limits placed on confidentiality versus a duty to warn between a client and a therapist, of course. So the scenario might go something like this. You're a therapist. A client confesses that they have thought about harming someone specific, but they swear they won't act on it. What do you do in that circumstance? Well, confidentiality, we know, is sacred in therapy, but there are limits. You're going to read in this chapter about the Tarasoff case, happened in 1976. And you're going to discover that if a therapist believes a client poses a real threat to someone, they must break confidentiality to protect the potential victims. But what about gray areas? What about if the threat is kind of vague? What if it's a past crime they've already committed? What do you do? A lot to think about here because a therapist can be sued for not breaking confidentiality when it's necessary. Okay. Third dilemma I want to bring up is about dual relationships. So I can give you a couple of scenarios here. Let's say a small town psychologist sees a new client, but this new client, unbeknownst to the clinician, turns out to be their child's teacher. Or another therapist is asked to counsel their best friend's spouse. Or maybe a therapist's former client invites them to their wedding. Are you allowed to do that? Should you do that? Is it okay to do that? All of these are dual relationships. A dual relationship is where a psychologist has another role in the client's life besides just the therapy. And when that happens, it can lead to conflicts of interest and biases and obviously ethical dilemmas, right? This is especially problematic in smaller communities where avoiding those dual relationships is sometimes nearly impossible. So the question becomes then, how do we navigate them ethically? Now we know that when it comes to dual relationships, we also know that it will be unethical to engage in certain behavior, right? In some cases, it's unavoidable. The good news is that in some of those cases, the ethical guidelines provide some flexibility, but not always. And I guess knowing when that flexibility applies and when it doesn't is really important. Okay, so that's 3 big ones. Here's another one that's coming into play in recent times, the AI therapist, artificial intelligence therapist. Ethics in a digital age. We've never had to deal with this before. Maybe you can imagine a world where therapy is done entirely by AI. There's no human therapist needed. Watch your job security there. I see this as potentially happening. An AI therapy, while not entirely done by AI, it's happening now. The question is, do you think AI therapy could be more ethical? Maybe because there's no personal conflicts or less bias. If you caught on there, you heard me say less bias instead of no bias here. And why would I say that? Well, remember that any AI model is programmed by a human, and inherent in any human being are biases. And these can influence any model that there is, can't it? So you're still having some bias, even if it was an AI model. On the other hand, maybe you think AI therapy would be totally unethical because there's no human connection. There's no real human empathy, and that's not good. I don't know. So anyway, just like the rise of teletherapy, AI-driven mental health apps, they raise new ethical questions like, how do we ensure privacy on online therapy? And can AI ever replace human therapists? Or what happens when an AI chatbot gives really bad mental health advice? Do you know that some therapy apps have already been caught violating privacy laws, even without their users realizing it? So, I mean, that's happening. So, here are my final thoughts. Ethics are not always black and white. Now, in B110, a ways back, we used to discuss Kohlberg's moral dilemma. I don't know why they removed it from the B110 textbook, but it was an interesting hypothetical situation that talked about black and white versus gray thinking and how that influenced someone who had to make a difficult moral decision. The story involves a man named Heinz, And he had a wife who was on her deathbed, and she needed some expensive drug to survive, but they couldn't afford it. So the moral dilemma was whether or not Heinz should steal the drug. Some thought or think it's a black and white issue. You follow the rules no matter what, don't steal. Others see it as a not so black and white issue. There are situations where rules need to be broken or at least bent. There are gray areas that influence our behavior. And so it goes on to pose that gray thinking is really of a higher order thinking than black and white thinking is. Well, when you think about clinical psychology, ethical dilemmas often live in those gray areas too. And as future psychologists or clinicians, you won't just follow rules. You can't. There's not really total black and white thinking. You have to think critically. You have to balance competing values. And sometimes you have to make some difficult decisions. So in closing, what I want you to do is to keep in mind this. Ethics in psychology changes over time. What's ethical today may not be ethical in the future. And what's not ethical today might be ethical in the future. So you have to keep up with things. I wish you luck. Cheers.